My name is Dan Chard, and I'm a PhD student here in the UMass History Department, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to the penultimate event in the UMass History Department's Fall 2012 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. This evening, we're very proud to present a panel of speakers who will discuss the question, is the U.S. ready for truth and reconciliation? In just a moment, I will introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Manisha Sinha, who will in turn introduce the panelists. But before I do that, I want to begin with a note about the final Feinberg event and a few words of thanks to some of the people who made this event possible. On Wednesday, December 5th at 4 p.m. here in Cape Cod Lounge, we'll have our capstone panel with 3 historians speaking on their perspectives on the relationship between studying history and seeking truth, working towards reconciliation and striving for justice. I hope that many of you will be able to join us for this stimulating conclusion to the lecture series. And now for some thank yous. I'd like to recognize the History Department Chair, Professor Joy Bowman, staff members Jean Ball and Rochelle Vigors, and other members of the Feinberg Series Committee, Brian Bunk, Jill Dwiggins, Marla Miller, and especially our chair, Sigrid Schmalzer, who helped really make this whole series possible. Also, yeah, thank you. Also, thank you to Catherine Julian and Samuel Dodge. These are TAs for the History 200 course that Professor Schmalzer is teaching around this theme of truth and reconciliation, history and justice this semester. And you know, they've been accommodating all these events and lots of extra work. So thank you to them. Also, just I'd like to acknowledge, you know, people who've come from the greater, not only from UMass, but the greater community, including many people from the social justice movements of the area, including students against mass incarceration. And finally, I'd like to extend our deepest appreciation to History Department alum Kenneth Feinberg, whose generosity makes it possible for us to offer a speaker series like this once every 2 years. For those who don't already know, Kenneth Feinberg is a nationally recognized lawyer who served as director of the Congressional Fund to assist families of those killed or injured in the attacks of September 11th, 2001. His book, What is Life Worth?, grew out of that experience. More recently, he has also overseen compensation for victims of the BP oil spill. We think that the theme of this series, Truth and Reconciliation, History and Justice, reflects Kenneth Feinberg's interest very well, for he is always asking, what is our collective responsibility to victims, and what would it take to make things right for them? And now I'd like to introduce the chair of our panel, Professor Manisha Sinha. Manisha Sinha is a professor of Afro-American Studies here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She received her PhD from Columbia University. Her first book, titled The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, was published in 2000, and she has another book, To Live and Die in the Holy Cause, Abolition and the Origins of America's Interracial Democracy, forthcoming from Yale University Press. She's also co-editor of several important edited volumes in her field. In 2011, she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed on faculty at the University of Massachusetts, and delivered the Distinguished Faculty Lecture. In 2006, she was elected a member of the American Antiquarian Society, and in 2003, she was appointed to the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecture Series. She's a recipient of numerous fellowships, including much coveted grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's also one of those truly admirable scholars who actively seeks engagement with the broader public. You can find her blogs in the New York Times Opinionator, the Huffington Post, and the History News Network. Most importantly, and we thank her for agreeing to chair this panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that very generous introduction and introduction to the introducer. I'd like to welcome you all to our panel today on Is the U.S. Ready for Truth and Reconciliation? And we have a very distinguished group of panelists here to speak to you. Our first speaker, Professor Joya Aitoro, is the inaugural director of the University of Arkansas Little Rock Institute on Race and Ethnicity. She is also an associate professor of law at the university's William H. Bowen School of Law. Professor Aitoro has extensive experience working domestically and internationally to obtain remedies for historical and present-day wrongs to people of color, women and other oppressed groups. She is a lifetime member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and has served on its board of directors as co-chairperson of its board and as its national director. Ms. Aitoro represented the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at the World Conference Against Racism, including attending all the preparatory meetings and serving as a leader of the African and African Descendants Caucus. She also represented WILPF at the Hague Appeal for Peace in 1997. In 1995, she coordinated the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law's delegation to the United Nations Conference on Women in Beijing, and also represented that organization at the 2000 Beijing +5. Professor Aitoro is a founding member of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, NCOBRA. She served as co-chair of NCOBRA at its founding and as chair of its Legal Strategies Commission from 1992 to 2004. She was co-chair of the Reparations Coordinating Committee with Charles Ogletree Jr. that represented the survivors and direct descendants of victims of the 1921 destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that case was Alexander versus the state of Oklahoma. We are very pleased to have her here. She was supposed to speak to my class yesterday, which turned out to be a holiday. And so instead, they're all here to hear you talk today about continuing consequences of slavery and Jim Crow, building the bridge we must cross for truth and reconciliation. Professor Aitoro.
Thank you. I was telling Soffiyah when I was listening, said, do you remember years ago when none of that was true? So we've been together a long, long time. And so don't be surprised, young folk, when 30, 40 years from now, somebody reads your bio and you look around and say, but I remember when I was just in college, So I really appreciate being asked to be a part of this panel and this distinguished lecture series. It's very, very much an honor to do so. And so I want to thank you and others who were responsible for this and the opportunity. So I've got a couple of things. I don't know if anyone has ever, you write your presentation and then you rewrite it and then you say, well, maybe I should say something else. So I'm going to just go with the flow in terms of my outline. But one of the things that I thought was important was to talk about what is really truth and reconciliation. We throw those terms around, and I think sometimes, as with many terms, we talk about, when we think about it, do we really know what that is? And truth and reconciliation go together because you can't really have reconciliation of anything unless you have the truth about it. We can look at it on a one-to-one person situation where you have some argument or disagreement with someone and you want to bring yourselves together. And before you could really bring yourselves back together, you got to talk about your truth. Sometimes truth is not a truth, it is your truth. And you have to talk about your truth. And in the work that I've done for maybe, sort of think, oh my God, I've been doing this a long time. But the work I've been doing, one of the things that I've come to realize is that we really are not going to have, if we focus just in terms of the United States, which has been one of my primary focuses, and one of my primary focuses is in the continuing vestiges of slavery. So slavery and the continuing vestiges, so the reconciliation of Africans and African descendants and whites. I was at a program at our campus and a woman spoke who has a table that they call the eating table or something to that title in Mississippi, and she organized this table for people to come and talk. And one of the things that she said was, is there any way you can reconcile blacks and whites? Because reconciliation actually means there was something together to begin with. And if we look at that in some ways, I think she's correct. I mean, that maybe we use the term reconciliation as an easy term, but in and of itself, I think it's a misleading term, because it somehow assumes that there was a unity between black and whites, and I am talking about black and white, that really was never there. The fact that all of us know the history of slavery and the forced abduction of Africans from Africa, and so there was never a point at which in the history of the United States at its very beginning that there was some unity, so to speak, between whites and blacks such that we can reconcile. So that doesn't make me dismayed. That is another truth. And it's one that allows us not to live a fiction that somehow we were, in fact, buddy-buddy. You know, y'all just made me mad, and so I got mad at black folks, so I decided I was going to punish them. So no, that was not the case. So with that truth, that's the base truth. And the base truth is then here we all are in the United States of America in 2012, on our way to 2013. And we're talking about truth and reconciliation, but I think what we're really talking about is how do we, in a very honest, truthful way, somehow join together as allies beyond simply our one-on-one or our organization to organization. How do we resolve the vestiges of the institution, that peculiar institution of enslavement? And I think the first thing that we have to do is to recognize what that peculiar institution was and really recognize it, because I think so many times, and I'm not going to go into a history of slavery. Many of you are students and many of you are scholars or students, and you'll study that. Plus, I don't have enough time. But I think it's important because sometimes you hear people attempting to dress it up, you know, and to make it palatable. And I read quite a bit, and I know that everybody, you know, every white person wasn't this horrible, mean person that, you know, beat and raped and all of that. But the institution itself allowed for that, and it did exist. And the institution itself at base, was inhumane because it somehow allowed for this concept of chattel ownership, that somehow I owned somebody, that I could just decide I want to make some money so I can put them up on an auction block and can sell that somebody to someone that I had no idea what they were going to do with them, but I needed the money or wanted the money or whatever. So it was really, we had this debate at our school, and you know, sometimes I can't really debate till I get, you know, calm down a little bit. I don't know if you all have ever been there, you know, because used to be I didn't calm down, and I realized that that doesn't help the dialogue. So, but the debate of whether or not this was just you know, slavery's existed since human beings probably, and so this was just something that, you know, Africans enslaved Africans and blah, 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 and all of that. But if you look at the history as I've seen it, that this chattel slavery was something different. It was something different. And so the difference in capsule, it seems to me, and this kind of leads us to the vestiges, the difference in capsule is that my ancestors lost all sense of who they were. They lost the right to speak their language. They lost the right to practice their religion. They lost the right to be in a unit that we call family. They lost that. They lost it. They were torn away from their families, but as they began to bond with others, they were torn away from that. And there's this, you know, view. I mean, I think it's Maya Thomas, but I'm blanking on the author's name. But she writes these beautiful little books on slavery, And it's illustrated. And one of the things that, and I was trying to find it before I left home, but I couldn't. So that shows you it's still in a box somewhere that I haven't unpacked in the past 10 years. But the thing that got me in when I was reading her little book is she quoted, or at least had this statement about a mother watching her children sold into slavery. And I'm not even a mother, I own a cat. And so I can say I own my cat, okay? But I can't even imagine, and I don't know if any of you could imagine what it must feel like for a mother, and then we can add father, because some fathers watched too, watch their children be sold into slavery, knowing what slavery was, number one, but even if not, they're taken from you. You may never see them again. And in many instances, they didn't. So when we look at slavery, when we look at the truth, those are some of the truths that we have to allow ourselves to hear. And sometimes we don't want to allow ourselves to hear it. We want to say, well, you know, maybe it really wasn't that bad, or let's just let bygones be bygones. And I wrote a little article once and said, when people were using that line to fight against reparations, is that it would be great to let bygones be bygones if they were bygone, okay? But they're not bygone because we're living with them now. So when we tell those truths about slavery, when we do more than what I had in high school, I was talking to a class today, and what I had in high school, and I dare say many of you probably had the same thing, and I'm shocked, probably I wouldn't be shocked to know that some of you who are a lot younger than me had the same thing, is that, you know, I don't think I know we didn't spend a whole class on slavery. I mean, slavery was like just a bump in the road. You know, here we are, slavery, bam, let's move on, okay? So we really didn't learn about it. So what we learned is the folklore about it. And a lot of the folklore about it kind of dressed it up, right? It dressed it up. It made it not to be ever palatable, but more palatable. The thing that I think when we talk about then the truths is we have to talk about what are the truths of the vestiges. And, you know, again, let's let bygones be bygones. Well, they're not bygone. Because what did the institution of slavery do? You know, what did it do? Well, you know, we can look at, and I want to just look at like maybe 3 areas. Let's look at the area of punishment. We now call it criminal justice. But let's look at the area of punishment. Well, first of all, an enslaved person didn't even have to go through due process at all. Okay? So if I'm accused of stealing, I must be guilty if the master so-called thought I stole. And so my punishment wasn't to go down to court and have a judge hear my case and me be able to testify that I really didn't steal and the master so-called testifying that I did. The person who was so-called my owner, and I say so-called because I'm not sure how any human being can own another human being, okay? I'm just being real. I mean, in law, it was there, but how do you do that? So, you know, depending on what that person felt at the time, you know, I could be lashed, you know, I could, you know, have some limb of mine taken or just whatever he thought was the case. And he can be punished for it. If in fact it was, in quotes, excessive punishment, because what could be excessive? He owns you, he's your child, just like he could do whatever he wants to a cow or a horse or whatever. So the punishment system for enslaved Africans was without any bounds. It was just up to the feeling and thought, belief system of the person that was said to have owned them. But then if we look at the history of the punishment system, and it was interesting, you know, we were talking the other day in the school, and we were talking about the fact that the first prisons that, as we know them, started, what, in 1830, you know, this beginning of prisons, so to speak. Well, who was in those prisons? It wasn't us. You know, it was white folk, right? And the Quakers started this prison or penitentiary, and penitentiary means penitent, and, you know, you can just sit there in solitude and meditate, and, you know, if you just kind of meditate on the errors of your ways, you can come back into society and do all these wonderful things. Well, you know, I don't want to take anything away from what Soffiyah might say, but we see a turn in the concept of prisons when? After the Civil War. After the Civil War. And then we got to do something with these Africans, or these black folks, or these whatever they call us. And so prisons began to take on this real punitive tone. And so as we developed prisons, it became that. So part of what we see now with, I'm sure all of you have heard mass incarceration and all of that. Well, what we're seeing today is, as my colleague, and it was mentioned, Charles Ogletree, and also a colleague of my sister here, Soffiyah, says it's an unbroken chain. Our criminal punishment system is an unbroken chain from slavery. It takes a little different face here and there, but it's the same thing, okay? So let's then look at health. Some of you probably know, and maybe some of you don't, but you're gonna know it now because I'm going to tell you, that African enslaved women, and one of the fictions was that enslaved Africans really got better health care, right, than white folk, right, who didn't have any money, right? And because the owners, of course, cherished their property, and so they didn't want them to get really sick and die because they were valuable, you know, they cared about it. So they, you know, so we have all of this history of health, which again, I'm not going to go into. But the problem with that story is it leaves out probably a whole lot more than what I'm going to tell you. But it leaves out the fact that Africans were subjected to all kinds of cruelty because they were also fodder for research and experimentation. And so we have the case of Anarchia and several other African enslaved women who were subjected to the surgeries, and I forget the exact name of the surgery, but to close the fissure between the anus and the vagina area. They were subjected to experimental surgery. I think Anarchia had 28 or so surgeries of this kind without any anesthesia, okay? And I know I'm like, I do like this when I hear about it, right? But it was done to show you, to me, the hypocrisy, but the contradictions in our history is it was done by the person who is now called the father of gynecology, Sims. Got a big old statue in New York, okay? But it was the bodies of African women that were subjected to this torture. I don't know about you, but I need Novocaine when I have a tooth filled, you know? But they were subjected to this torture for the purpose of medicine, to develop treatment that was more likely to be given to white women. And of course, if you read a little bit on the history, when he started utilizing these methods on white women, oh, they had anesthesia, okay? They had anesthesia. So that's a legacy, but why is it a legacy? Oh, surely this isn't still happening. But we have example after example of African women, African descendant women bodies being disregarded in terms of health care, sterilized, utilization of African women to test various, what was that, the birth control methods, the implants and all of that. So it's a continuation. A little different, okay, no longer Anarchia, but still, you know, we have African children, African descendant children who did not realize that they had been sterilized in North Carolina and probably other places, but found out about it when they got older and wanted to have children, and they had been sterilized, okay? So, and of course there's this intersection with the criminal punishment system because many times in North Carolina and other places, young women who were, especially during the so-called drug war, young women who were, and usually African women, who were being accused of being a drug addict, that was part of a remedy. That was like, you know, we're just gonna sterilize you, right? So that occurs, so it's cross-section in that way. And then if we look at education, continuing vestige. I mean, all of what we know about slavery and what we were talking about today in the women in slavery class, and I have the class had read, and I had too, the narrative of Harriet Jacobs and an enslaved African. And one of the things is she talked about is that her mistress, one of them, when she was little, her mistress, was very kind to her because her mistress taught her how to read and write. Well, that's very important because it was really against the law to teach enslaved Africans to read and write in many states that they were enslaved. So this mistress was breaking the law, but it was a kindness that she felt. But I mean, think about the fact that for how many centuries, 200 years or more, Africans were denied education by law, okay? So then we jump ahead and we have all, you know, the differences between public education for whites and blacks after slavery. And, you know, I've had even people that I know who talked about how their mothers and fathers said that they never had a new book in their school. They got books and they knew all the white children in the white schools. The white children didn't know them. But they knew them because the white children's names were written all in the books. Because they got the hand-me-down books, okay? The used books, the books with torn pages, pages that may have writing scratched out or whatever. So now we're talking about this big mystery, jumping ahead, because I don't know how much more time I have. 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes? Okay, 5, okay. Then she said, no, not 2. So we have all of this history, and we're talking about now what? The education gap, okay? And we have this big education gap, which of course, if you're devoid of history, if you divorce history from our current conditions, you think, those poor black and Latino children, my goodness, they just can't keep up with these smart white kids. What are we gonna do? We have to have extra programs. Well, the education gap was a creation, in terms of black people, was a creation of slavery. It was a creation of slavery. And it never ended after slavery. There was no infusion in the black communities at so-called emancipation of educational tools, and we're gonna, you know, let's catch up. Much like there was no providing of Africans who were emancipated with land and money or anything. It was like, you free. Go do what you're gonna do, which means many of them became sharecroppers, right? So our gap is not, if you ahistorical, if we look at it simply as something that's current day. You're being ahistorical and you're not going to resolve it. You're not. So in order to reconcile these issues as opposed to people, to reconcile the continuing disparities and inequities, really, not disparities, that are really in terms of African and white, are because of the flow from the system of slavery, we have to tell the truth about that these were created inequities. These weren't just happened to be. So if we're going to do truth and reconciliation, that's where we start. That's the bridge. The other thing, and then I want to kind of wrap up with this, is that in our truth and reconciliation processes that all of us are familiar with, some of them, South Africa is the most popular, well-known, Argentina, there have been quite a few. Argentina was the first. But one of the things that was critical for them was a couple of things that I don't think we have here, so I have a recommendation at the end. And first it was that you have to have the will. You have to have national will, okay? You have to have, it must be reflective of national will to have reconciliation. And there must be a national commitment to fully understand and learn from history. So I dare say we all should know, all of us are old enough to know right now that we have no national will or commitment to reconcile, because people want to say, particularly whites in power, that there's nothing to reconcile, everything is fine and hunky-dory. And we have people of color who believe the same thing, so I don't want to just, you know, make it a either-or kind of thing. So we don't have a national will. We had H.R. 40, which Congressman Conyers introduced in Congress, has introduced in Congress every congressional session since 1989. Never have had a real full hearing of any real. He had a hearing, what, 2-3 years ago when the Democrats were in the majority. But it was a hearing in which there was not really any full participation by Congress. I mean, this was more of just something he did, and Charles Ogletree and others helped him organize, but it wasn't really a national statement, I'll put it that way. So we don't have it. We all know, hopefully we saw the first term of Obama, and for those of you who, I don't mean any disrespect, but who are naive enough to think that racism didn't just come out the pores of the walls when this man became president, we can talk later. But, I mean, just examples. Wilson, senator representative from North Carolina or South Carolina, Howland, South Carolina, said, don't give North Carolina that bad of a name, huh? But screaming down, you lied. He would never have done that if that had been a white president, regardless of how he disagreed with him. On and on. We can talk on and on. All kinds of examples. And then most recent, I mean, the one that gets me that I have to say as I'm speeding to finish is we want to take our country back. Hello? What does that mean? That's racism, folk. Our country, what about us? And not just us black, not just us Latino, but us whites who supported him, okay? Our country. So, and then we have the response to the World Conference Against Racism where the United States walked out. It refused to stay and participate. It says that it was done, it gives two reasons. One was because of the language that they had been suggested calling the Israelis Zionists, which in fact basically saying they were racist, and the other was the movement language around reparations in the documents, which did come, though they knew at that point when they pulled out that the language that they were complaining of in terms of Zionism had already been dropped. So what do we do? Okay. What do we do? So I painted a bleak picture, right? You know, I think that, you know, it's going to be years and years before we're in a place in the United States where we can really have a true Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But we can do what other organizations have done consistently, which is we can have our own Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And we can have them in public spaces and invite our public officials. And that's how we can build knowledge about truth and what it's going to take to reconcile. But it's also how we educate, because we recognize that our victories that we have won, and we have had victories, have been because people were educated. And we can't just say because the Congress of the United States or the legislature of Massachusetts or any other official body won't hold a Truth and Reconciliation hearing that it can't be held, because we are the people, and we can hold them, and we can invite people, and we can have people on the ground testify, not just these highfalutin scholars who can come and talk about it, but have families come. Somebody represent families and your family and all of that. So that's my recommendation, that if we're going to have true truth and reconciliation, we're going to have to do it. And we're going to have to be willing to stand on our truth. We're going to have to be willing to hear it, and to not just hear my truth as an African woman, but to hear the white person's truth that was perhaps involved in some way, family may have been an enslaver or whatever, but also others. So that truth is on all sides, but we have to be willing to hear it, and then we have to be willing to say, okay, how do we then come together as a true collective to work towards similar goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aitoro. As a historian of slavery, I can, just second that vision of actually understanding first the history of slavery and its consequences before we even begin talking about truth and reconciliation. So our next speaker today is Soffiyah Elijah. She earned her Bachelor of Arts from Cornell University and Juris Doctorate from Wayne State University Law School. She is the Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, an accomplished advocate, attorney, scholar, and educator. Ms. Elijah is the first woman and the first person of color to lead the nearly 170-year-old organization in its mission to create a fairer, more effective, and humane criminal justice system. Prior to joining the staff of the Correctional Association in March 2011, Ms. Elijah served as Deputy Director and a clinical instructor at the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. At the institute, she trained hundreds of law students to become effective and ethical lawyers and to engage in local and national reform of criminal and juvenile justice policies. A native New Yorker, Ms. Elijah practiced criminal and family law in New York City for more than 20 years. Before moving to Harvard, she was a member of the faculty and director and supervising attorney of the Defender Clinic at the City University of New York School of Law. She was a supervising attorney at the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, where she defended indigent members of the Harlem community, and has also worked as a staff attorney for the Juvenile Rights Division of the Legal Aid Society. Honored by the Massachusetts chapter of the National Lawyers Guild in 2010, Ms. Elijah has dedicated her life to human rights and social activism. She is a recognized national and international authority on human rights issues and has served as a justice on several people's tribunals focused on the U.S. government's response to Hurricane Katrina, the testing of bombs in Puerto Rico, and conditions of confinement inside American prisons. She has authored several articles and publications on U.S. criminal and juvenile justice policy and prison conditions, and is a frequent presenter at national and international forums. Ms. Elijah.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I want to apologize to Adjoa and everyone else for dashing out just as she stood up, because we were sitting there kind of chatting, catching up on old times, and I realized in a dead panic that I'd left my notes in my hotel room. So you won't think that I'm rude. Thank you to everyone who worked so hard to organize this amazing event. Dan, Sigrid, Professor, you know I'm going to goof up your names, so I'm not going to try. And to everyone else who played a role in making this happen. It's really a wonderful occasion for me for many reasons. One, to get to reunite with Adjoa, and also with Judith Holmes, who I had the wonderful, we'll call it a wonderful experience of trying a 9-month RICO conspiracy case together in New York, oh gosh, a couple of decades ago. And a few weeks before that trial was to start, Judy said to me, you know, Soffiyah, after this, I'm retiring from the practice of law. You'll be out there on your own. So it's good to reunite and to see her, because she said she was going to go back to school, get her PhD in history, and come teach. And here she has been teaching for a number of years. So our theme tonight, what I'm going to focus on, is the U.S. criminal justice system ready for truth and reconciliation? Now, I'm told that I have about 20 minutes, more or less. Well, I can actually answer the question in about 6 seconds. The answer is no, but I'll elaborate a little bit on the no. As I was preparing my remarks today, it seemed important to me first to examine what do we define the word truth as being. Now, some of you might say, well, that's pretty obvious. But if you really think about your experience as a resident in the United States, you might find yourself actually now questioning if you had a firm understanding of the word truth. So let me tell you what I found in the dictionary. Sincerity in action, the body of real things, events, and facts. The opposite of falsehood. Actuality, a proposition or idea that is accepted as true. The property of being in accord with facts or reality. So now what does that have to do with the criminal justice system? Not much, unfortunately. Truth, as we've defined it, and truth as it has been incorporated in the practice of truth and reconciliation, requires honesty and transparency. Neither one of those things, I would submit to you, will you find if you study the criminal justice system, or if you have also, as I have, worked in it for a number of years. As Adjoa made reference to in her remarks, unfortunately, what we find in our criminal justice system here in the United States is best described in one word: hypocrisy. Pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. But truth and reconciliation requires introspection, reflection, honesty, admission, confession, remorse, and a willingness to change. Now, some of you might be saying, well, you know, the people who have been convicted of crimes, that's what they have to do. But that's not really who I'm focusing on. I'm talking about our society at large. I'm talking about the fact that we as a society have to take responsibility for the fact that the main thing that the United States is the #1 leader of in the world is incarceration. Warmongering and incarceration. Now, I don't know about you, those are really not the things I want to be remembered as, okay? But that's where we lead. Over 2.2 million people in this country are incarcerated behind bars, and over 65,000 are permanently disenfranchised because they have a felony conviction, and that number is rising. Truth and reconciliation has no room for hypocrisy. We can't move forward with any sincerity with truth and reconciliation until we address the hypocrisy that pervades our criminal justice system. Now, how do we define hypocrisy? Well, I love this. It is the practice of professing beliefs, feelings, or virtues that one does not hold or possess. That's us. Okay? Should I read it again for you? The practice of professing beliefs, feelings, or virtues that one does not hold or possess. How many of you have seen the representation of Lady Liberty holding up the scales with the blindfold, one eye uncovered? That's us. Okay. Anyone here not seen that? Okay, you're going to law school. And I'm sure you'll see it. Okay. The U.S. criminal justice system is reflective of the multiple levels of hypocrisy that we have in our larger society. Now, if you disagree with me, let me take you a few years back to a point in time and one of my favorite heroes in U.S. history, Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, in a drunken stupor, shot his dear friend in the face at close range, causing permanent damage. How many of you remember the investigation that followed that shooting? How long did it last? Less than that. Less than a day. There was no investigation. Okay? Was there any prosecution? No. Dick Cheney have to answer in Congress? No. Anybody asked to look at the gun? Breathalyzer, maybe? No. Now let me compare Dick Cheney to three people that I know very well. First one I'll call Gerald. I met Gerald when he was 14 years old in Boston, in juvenile court in Dorchester. Gerald was accused of possession, not firing, not aiming at, possession of a gun. Gerald was arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison. Gerald did not hold a government office, and he did not enjoy the privilege of being a middle-aged white male in Washington, D.C. Now let's talk about Robert. I met Robert when Robert was 13 years old. Robert was in and out of the juvenile system, having been the child of a mother who was mentally ill, who dealt with her mental illness through alcoholism. A father who was unemployed, also mentally ill, who routinely beat Robert's mother in front of the children. Robert was arrested and charged with possession of crack. Not selling crack, possession of crack. Not shooting his best friend in the face. He was arrested, charged, prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison. And he's in solitary confinement right now at 18 years old in Walpole Prison, having been sentenced to 6 months in solitary for the offense of fighting inside. Now, if you know anything about being in prison, fights are as common as brushing your teeth. And then there's the last one, and I'll call him Lawrence. Lawrence, brilliant student, graduated from high school, full scholarship to college. Lawrence's older brother and sister both were heroin addicts. He was raised by his aunt in the hopes that he would not succumb to the same life that his older brother and sister did. But unfortunately, he did get caught up in drugs, and he developed a heroin addiction also. And to support that habit, he pulled a robbery of a local bodega. He was arrested, charged, prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison for 12 years. Robert, Lawrence, and Gerald didn't have the privilege of Dick Cheney. And they manifest the reality of the demographics that we find in our prison system throughout this country. African American and blacks comprise 13.6% of the US population according to the 2010 census. But yet, 1 in 3 African American males find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. 1 in 3. And some 60 to 65% of the prison population across this country is comprised of African American people, although we comprise only 13.6% of the US population. And for Latinos and Hispanics, 1 in 7 Hispanic males find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system, although they comprise 16.7% total of the US population. But for white males, 1 in 14. Now, some of you might be saying, well, you know, poverty drives crime, and therefore, you know, blacks and Latinos probably commit more crimes because they're committing these crimes. Don't even finish that mantra, because it's not true. Blacks and Latinos, all the research has shown, commit crimes at about exactly the same rate. But the rate at which they are prosecuted and convicted and sent to prison is drastically different. Drastically. Some of you may be familiar with what has been called the crack and powder cocaine disparity. Does anyone in here know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. Now, for those who don't, for decades in this country, people who were convicted of possession of crack were sentenced as if they had the equivalent of 100 times more cocaine. And why? Because crack was determined to be used more, it's more concentrated and cheaper, and determined to be used primarily in poor communities of color, whereas cocaine was more a drug of choice for more affluent white communities. Judges, prosecutors, social workers, defense lawyers all went to Congress and pleaded to have that law changed, to have the crack powder cocaine disparity law changed. And repeatedly, Congress refused. Finally, 2 years ago, they changed the law. And anybody want to hasten a guess to what the change was? 18. Right, 18-1. Now, if that's not hypocrisy in its purest form, pardon the pun, then I don't know what is. And then we look at so many other manifestations of hypocrisy in our criminal justice system. People are sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment, which means when you get there, the fact that your liberty has been taken away from you, that is the punishment. If anybody doubts that, is anyone here signing up to have their liberty taken away for a couple of years? So you can switch places with some of the people who've been down for about a few decades? Okay, no takers. All right, so taking away your liberty is punishment. But what happens to people when they're sent to prison? They're subjected to rape, malnutrition, inefficient health care, medical neglect, shipped away, far away from their families so that it's difficult to maintain ties with their families and community ties, provided with little or no educational opportunities, obsolete vocational opportunities, little to no programming, denied time and time again release on parole, and then, if they finally are released, what do they go home to? Well, what we as society provide to them in our hypocrisy. We provide them with an opportunity not to be allowed public housing, to be denied a job because they have a felony conviction, not to qualify for financial aid, not to be able to qualify for a Pell Grant, and on and on and on. And then we say, we expect you to reintegrate into society and become a contributing citizen with a ball and chain around your neck, okay? So we're guaranteeing that people are not going to make it. And the majority of those people look like me. Another manifestation of the hypocrisy that we have in our system is the mere fact that we prosecute young people as adults in this country. North Carolina and New York are the last remaining states that still prosecute 16 and 17-year-olds as an adult. Are there any people here who've ever been 16? Do you remember how stupid you were at 16? You might not want to remember, but admit to yourself. All right. And anybody here survived raising somebody who was 16? I got through it. Okay. Okay. I know, you don't want to tell people. It was a rough road, right? Why? Because teenagers do, pardon my language, dumb shit. They do. Okay? And so we don't prosecute them, or we should prosecute them as adults, because they're not prepared to function as adults. We don't allow them to drive many places. We don't send them to war, fortunately, yet. Okay? And I hope that yet is only satirical. And there's many other things. We don't allow them to vote, all right? But we prosecute them as adults. And then we send them to prison with adults. And what do you think happens to a 16-year-old in prison with adults? Do I need to fill in that gap? No. So we have the year of the child, and we say no child left behind, and then what do? We funnel them from the school to prison pipeline straight into adult prisons, destroying them for life, and then saying, okay, after you do 10, 20, 30, 40 years, come out in society and be a contributing member and don't get rearrested. The likelihood of success is about -0. How am I doing in time? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, no minutes? She says 5. I can work that. Okay. And then on the flip side, look at what we're doing to our elderly who are incarcerated. Many advocates against the death penalty won a true victory by getting rid of the death penalty. But the flip side was that in many jurisdictions, the compromise was to institute life without parole. And life without parole means just that. Now, I don't know about you, but I have yet to see one 80-year-old person take their walker and assault anyone. But we have 60 and 70 and 80-year-old people incarcerated throughout this country who present absolutely no risk to public safety. In New York State, the oldest person incarcerated is 88 years old. There's someone in New York, there's several people in New York actually, who are incarcerated who are chained to a hospital bed and they are in a coma. All right, now you tell me. You ever been assaulted by somebody in a coma? Not likely to happen. It costs $56,000 a year to incarcerate somebody who's under 40, and upwards at least of $200,000 a year to incarcerate someone who's in their 80s because of the amazing need for medical care that can't be provided at the facility, so they have to be taken to a hospital, chained to the hospital bed, and guarded 24 hours a day by at least 2 guards. You want to figure out what the overtime rate is for that? where we could release people at age 40 or less, because recidivism rates drop drastically at age 40, no risk to public safety, give people an opportunity to regain their lives, send them home, and start to have a more humane approach to the criminal justice system. But no, we don't do that. We keep on locking up older and older people, so that although prison populations are decreasing in some jurisdictions, we find that the rate of incarceration of people 55 and older has increased by 64%. And at the rate that we're going, by 2030, there will be over 400,000 people incarcerated who are over 55 years of age. So if you think locking up grandma and grandpa is a good idea, then don't say anything about what's happening in our country. That is what I mean by hypocrisy. We have to band together to change what's going on in this country with respect to our criminal justice system. Many call it the criminal injustice system, and that's probably the best way to describe it. So are we ready for truth and reconciliation? Not by a long shot. We first have to get real comfortable with the word truth and start living it. And maybe if we do that, then we can force our elected officials to do the same. Because they say that they do our bidding, but we better make sure to it. We better make sure that people who are convicted of a crime get their right to vote and never lose their right to vote. Why shouldn't people who are incarcerated be allowed to vote? Who says that they shouldn't be? It's certainly not deemed in the Constitution that you have to lose your right to vote. We have to make sure that we change this system. Otherwise, our society is going to be doomed to continue to be the leader in doing things backwards in this world, and we will pay the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Soffiyah, for that talk. I think you really did expose the fiction of equality before the law, right, in that talk, and really exposed in a way what many scholars are talking about now in the context of the United States, which is the development of, quote, the carceral state, that has become one of the primary functions of the state in this country. Now, our last speaker is Liz Shevchenko. She is the director of the Guantánamo Public Memory Project. Liz was founding director of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, a network of historic sites that foster public dialogue on pressing contemporary issues. Starting in 1999 as a meeting of 9 sites under the auspices of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, under her leadership, the coalition grew to over 250 members in more than 40 countries. It launched regional networks in Russia, South America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as international immigration sites of conscience network and a binational US and Canada Indian boarding schools project, established as an independent organization and grew from a budget of 100,000 to over 1.3 million. As coalition director, Shevchenko, which I can see she can barely wait to get started, worked with initiatives in more than 60 countries to design replicable programs and practices that reflect on past struggles and inspire citizens to become involved in addressing their contemporary legacies. Before launching the coalition, Shevchenko had over 10 years of experience developing public history projects designed to catalyze civic dialogue in New York and around the country. As vice president for programs at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, she developed exhibits and educational activities that connect the dramatic stories of the neighborhood's immigrants past and present. She also developed national and community initiatives to inspire civic dialogue on cultural identity, labor relations, housing, welfare, immigration, and other issues raised by these stories. She has published extensively on sites of conscience in journals and edited volumes in a variety of fields, from human rights to cultural heritage to transnational justice. Shevchenko has a BA from Yale University and is ABD in history at New York University. The Guantánamo Public Memory Project builds public awareness of the long history of the U.S. naval station at Guantánamo Bay, Cuba, before and after 9/11, and fosters dialogue on the future of this place, its people, and its policies. It produces digital media, a traveling exhibit, and teaching and research resources. So now that I know that Liz can't wait to get started, I'm going to hand over the floor to her. And after her talk, I will invite the panelists to come up here, and we can have a short question and answer session. Okay, Liz.
Thank you. As everybody has extended their thanks to Sigrid and Dan, I also want to thank my fellow panelists. I really enjoyed hearing your talks, and it's a real honor to be on the same bill with you. So I'm going to bring you back to the first days, heady days of the Obama administration in January of 2009, when, as one of his very first acts, Obama pledged to, quote, close Guantánamo. And I was, at that time, as my colleague mentioned, director of something called the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And this was a collection of places of memory, many of which were former sites of detention and torture, that nevertheless were incredibly diverse in their particular political context and what they were remembering. But the phone lines kind of lit up when this happened because Obama's declaration really resonated among this group. They included, just to give you a sense, places as diverse as the Gulag Museum in Russia, which took an abandoned Stalinist labor camp and transformed it into a museum and a place for discussion among young people in this remote region in the Ural Mountains about questions, their own definitions and visions of freedom, civil liberties, and national security, and their own conversations about what terrorism and containing terrorism meant in the Russian context, and created in this former prison the most free place for discussion that could be found in this remote region for miles. But it also included places like the one that I really came out of that were not remembering mass atrocities, but instead were trying to look, to put it in this context, at certain truths about the past and use them to identify what the legacies of those histories were that we were facing every day, and open discussion about those legacies with the benefit of history. So they included places like the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which remembered the individual families that lived in one building in the Lower East Side who had come from many parts of the world as immigrants, and who continued to kind of inhabit and provide perspective on the lives of the many new immigrant families that were continuing to live cheek by jowl in the neighborhood today. And using those juxtaposition and the continuing story and struggle over immigration to ask challenging questions that history raises that were still very much unresolved and hotly contested in the neighborhood and in the nation today. So this was a very diverse group of sites that when we first came together in 1999, kind of formulated or coined this term site of conscience. And we had been working this way on these three issues for about a decade when, as I said, Obama made this declaration. So we had been asking ourselves the question of, or defining ourselves along the common goal of tapping the power of place, interpreting history through sight, and really identifying what people could learn about history and its continued relevance in the present by looking at place. The second commitment that we made was to stimulate dialogue on pressing social issues that our history raises. So really asking questions about the connections between the past and the present, and creating new spaces for conversation about very challenging questions in historical perspective. And the third was to try and move beyond dialogue to action by being spaces where people could become informed about the avenues available to them to shape the issues that they cared about most. So this was sort of what we had been working on for about a decade as a new kind of role for historic sites and a new place for history in civic life. So when Obama made his declaration, as I said, the kind of phone started ringing, and many sites around the world that had witnessed their own kinds of political transitions, and I don't know how many of you have attended previous lectures in this series, but you probably heard a lot about many of those transitions and how the struggles over them. But they recognized that whether or not this objective was ever achieved, just the statement to close Guantanamo was opening a real possibility and was sort of an invitation for not only the sort of divided, very polarized communities within the United States to begin confronting together the history of what had happened there since 9/11, but also an opportunity for us and our international previous allies and not allies to talk about what this meant for the world. But there was a real concern that the discussion and the virulent debate that erupted immediately after Obama made his declaration was being held in a historical vacuum, and it was being held without any understanding of how the fact that Guantanamo didn't sort of emerge from the sea in 2002, but in fact had been used and reused in many different ways over time, and in fact been opened and closed before, only to be reopened for different uses. So we began talking about what could be done about this. So this was in January. Obama makes his declaration. In March, the question of is the U.S. ready for truth and reconciliation of the panel was answered very well by my previous panelists, and also can be answered through the fleeting, very short life of this particular proposal. In March, when there was a Senate hearing about the possibility of what quickly became nicknamed the Bush Truth Commission. And this was there was so much softness around it. It was not going to be, it was a nonpartisan commission commission of inquiry. It was just looking at what happened. It didn't have any proposal for any kind of prosecution or any kind of criminal investigation, none of that, but it was simply to explore what happened, explore the truth of Bush counterterrorism practices during the Bush era. And this crashed and burned so quickly that most people never even heard about it. So by June of that year, so just a few months later, it was very clear this was dead, and the coalition brought together its own sort of collection of different people who had different experiences and a different stake in this question of remembering Guantanamo. So it included historians of the base, but also lawyers representing detainees, both post 9/11 and also people who had been held there at other times, former military interrogators, archivists, artists, sort of a whole range of people who had had direct experience on the base or who had a real stake in getting this truth about it out. And we just asked three very simple questions. What should be remembered about Guantanamo? Why was it relevant for now? And who should be involved? And by this point, it was clear, and again, my former panelists really particularly made this point that there wasn't the political will, but nevertheless, most of the major sort of state-led truth and reconciliation efforts in other parts of the world were first generated through long struggles by civil society groups or by people way outside the system. But it became clear in this moment that any kind of search for truth about Guantanamo or opening of a question about reconciliation was going to have to be done by groups, by non-official people. And this created both a greater opportunity and a greater burden of responsibility for a proposed public memory project. So this was the sort of situation we were in then. And again, the main, in order to be able to confront or to even engage in a discussion about closing Guantánamo or talk about what happened, the group really felt that it was important to be able to understand how we got to this point and all of the different layers of openings and closings and of using this place to kind of create, to defend against perceived threats and kind of what that meant about the past and about the proposed future. As this fence, the image of this fence kind of implies, we just keep building more borders at Guantánamo to kind of keep out more potential threats. We decided to begin then at the moment when many of us felt that it all started. Some felt that it started with the geological formation of the bay, but that's like a little difficult. From as a historian, I really respect that. It works well in a book, but for public memory, it's kind of. So we chose to start the conversation, at least, not to say that the history started here, but start the conversation with the raising of the U.S. flag in Guantánamo in 1898, because this was the moment when the contest, the argument, and the ambiguity really began. After ousting the Spanish from Cuba, we celebrated Cuba's independence, but exacted it at a price of giving, of sort of articulating the U.S.'s vision of how it would operate as an imperial power, as an empire, which was always to control without occupying. So we exacted a lease from Cuba that, from the new state of Cuba, that granted Cuba total sovereignty. So it celebrated Cuban independence and made sure that this was established as Cuban soil, but granted the U.S. total jurisdiction and control. So what that did in that moment was to establish what some legal scholars have called a legal black hole, where it was not clear whose laws applied in this place. Was it Cuban laws because it's Cuban soil, or is it U.S. laws because we maintain total jurisdiction and control? And everything that you've ever heard about Guantánamo since then really it is just a vestige of this debate that is still going on. We also felt that it was important to understand that Guantánamo has many different faces and many different lives. That like many military bases, it was built by Cuban workers, or in this case by Cuban workers, built up as this kind of tiny little small town America, and that there was a whole community that called the base home, and that talked about it in completely different terms than those that we currently associate with it. So we've been conducting oral histories with people who have had a whole variety of different experiences on the base, and I'm just going to, hopefully if it works, play you a little bit of one.
My name is Anita Lewis Isom. I am retired from federal government civil service. First time I went to Gitmo because my father was civil service and got a job there, and that was from 1962 to 1971, and I was only 6 years old. I went back in October of 1977 to June of 1981, and then I went back in 1984 as a dependent spouse of a contractor and was there until 1986. My most vivid memories of Guantánamo was, everything just being free down there, and the closeness of all the people. I mean, there was no crime, none whatsoever. It was summer all year round. The water is just as crystal clear as it can be. And at the beaches, they had what was called a cabana, and you could rent it for $1 a day. That's where everyone was every weekend, was out at the beaches, and everybody knew everybody. It was just, it was wonderful growing up there in the 60s. We always say we want to go home. We all still call it home.
She goes on, though, and I don't have time to play this for you, but she goes on to describe how this kind of sense of security was suddenly punctured when her family was evacuated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically told that this was ground zero for nuclear annihilation and that she would have to leave overnight. And as a child, that was a very frightening thing. So this was always a balance between this sense of security and the sense of threat that loomed outside. much of this military, I'll just give you some snapshots of other moments in its history. So jumping ahead nearly 30 years, much of this community was needed to be evacuated when the first Bush administration saw over 20,000 Haitian migrants setting out to escaping political persecution from a coup in Haiti and hoping to make it heading for Miami. The Bush administration ordered the Coast Guard to intercept these migrants at sea and take them to Guantánamo, where they were, which at that point had the capacity to house about 5,000 people, and there were over 20,000 Haitian migrants who came, who were specifically put there in order to be in a place where U.S. refugee and immigration policies would not clearly apply. So they were sort of what was called pre-screened for refugee claims, even though, in retrospect and at the time, it was both lawyers and scholars could argue very clearly that the refugee claims were justified. This group also became the subject of the first mass screening of immigrants for HIV. This was 1991, in a moment when the U.S. was just formulating a policy or sort of debating whether, and it wound up doing so, to prohibit the entry of people with HIV to bar any immigrants from coming into the country who had HIV. That law was only recently overturned, but it was just sort of being worked out kind of while, almost on the bodies of the Haitians. The 200 or so who tested positive for HIV were segregated into separate camps where, just referring back to your earlier talk, Depo-Vera, I think that was what you were looking for, was given to many of the women here. And so it is sort of a legacy of the sort of health experiments. While the other 20,000 were forcibly repatriated, those 200 or so were kept on the soil of Guantánamo, neither being able to be returned to Haiti nor being admitted to the U.S. And it was through a tremendous amount of organizing, hunger strikes, media sort of getting media attention, writing, all kinds of ways that the refugees organized and got the attention of a legal team who launched both a major legal battle and what became a significant social movement here in the U.S. to close Guantánamo. It's parallel, in many ways to the manifestations that you may have seen, recently. And in fact, it was in many ways successful. In 1993, a Brooklyn, I'm proud to say, U.S. District Court judge closed Guantánamo by declaring it unconstitutional to hold people indefinitely, to hold these particular people indefinitely there. But in the final analysis, the final ruling freed the people who were held there and did grant them asylum for the most part in the U.S., but maintained the government's right to hold people indefinitely at Guantánamo. So the people were saved, but the principle remained. So while it was celebrated as a closing, only 2 years later, a whole new generation, or sort of new set of refugees sort of occupied some of the same space. And these were a huge wave of refugees from Cuba who left the island when Castro briefly lifted immigration restrictions and set off, again, in very unsecure makeshift rafts, headed for Florida. And President Clinton at the time also feared the consequences of admitting sort of so many people, having lost his governorship to a similar situation before. As president, he didn't want any political backlash again. And so again, sort of rerouted everybody to Guantánamo. While many people were very grateful to have been rescued at sea from what certainly would have been certain death, others became frustrated as time went on and the they were held behind barbed wire with no information about what would happen to them, whether they were going to be admitted to the U.S. or how their claims would be processed.
Me dijeron, yo dejé a mi familia para ayudarlas y estas meses aquí no las ayudo en nada, estando meses aquí.
He doesn't want to talk anymore. Oh, because I don't have internet access anymore. Let me see if I can get somebody else to talk. Okay. We'll hear about it another time. So these Cuban refugees were also held up to 2 years as their claims were finally processed one by one. And the closing of this camp, which again was through a lot of pressure by Miami-based groups, was a huge public ceremony. Gloria Estefan did a concert. There was an enormous amount of media attention, but some journalists recognized that while these camps were closing, that the Guantánamo had a future, and while this person couldn't have imagined what it was, that he could sort of see the possibilities. And in fact, just 3 years later, after this was closed in 1996, Clinton proposed parking 20,000 Kosovar refugees at Guantánamo who had been displaced during the Balkan Wars. And interestingly, this never happened because of a major opposition that was launched by people who remembered the sort of abuse of Cuban and Haitian refugees just 3 years before. But just 3 years after this, Camp X-Ray, that was a facility built for for sort of disciplining Haitian refugees, was a prison on the refugee camp site, was repurposed for the first enemy combatants who were brought from Afghanistan. And this is the same view of this place today that's now already sort of abandoned and being overgrown, although 166 prisoners still remain on the site. So our sort of memory of Guantanamo's recent history is already kind of being engulfed in weeds. When the group came together, we launched, there was a feeling that there really needed to be an action taken and that there should be some effort to build a public memory project around the following principles, to really look at a longer history from multiple perspectives that would address questions about the present. But again, this was a place that we all sort of agreed on, but there are many challenges and controversies around how to look at this history. Many advocates felt that using any word like remember or memory or even history was implying that the issues of Guantánamo were in the past, and that was really dangerous and a dangerous distraction. But places that you may have heard about in previous lectures in this series, like Memoria Abierta in Argentina, had a different experience where they had, in advocating for the disappeared, used the sort of framework of memory as a way of really keeping forgotten people in the public eye. So they really advocated for just sort of keeping even the current detainees in the public eye, and memory and remembering was a way of keeping people's attention on a place that continually gets forgotten. A lot of people also debated this point of origin. Isn't this really about what happened after 9/11, and therefore why should we go so far back? Isn't that also a distraction? What does 1898 have to do with it? But I think both our previous panelists have articulated this really well, and also examples of other truth commissions who were ostensibly addressing recent violence in the 1990s or even the 2000s would go decades back to the roots, particularly in post-colonial countries, would go back to slavery during the truth in Sierra Leone, for example, or would go back to pre-colonial times to really to say that you can't understand what happened recently unless you really go back to that. And there are other examples, like at the Tenement Museum, who had found that if you look at a place or a particular issue in the context of a more distant past, it sometimes can provide a different kind of starting point for a debate, and maybe an easier one than to start with raw issues where the lines have really been hardened on either side. A big debate was what sort of dialogue and multiple perspectives meant in this particular context. Does this mean that we're saying that torture is okay sometimes, and because that's what a lot of people say, is everything equally valid and open, and just sort of humanizing all experiences mean that we're legitimizing all of those opinions, and sort of asking what questions are okay to ask and what are we really saying is up for debate. There were examples of people, sites in the coalition like Constitution Hill in South Africa that remembered the old Fort prison and the people from Mandela to petty criminals who were incarcerated there, and could have celebrated it simply as a prison where the heroes of the anti-apartheid movement were imprisoned, and instead they asked much more difficult questions like who is a criminal, and whether the history of LGBT communities was part of the anti-apartheid struggle, and whether gay marriage was a legacy, should be a legacy and a value of civil rights in South Africa. And finally, the question of what's the role of place in all of this when we can't see it? And should this just be a project about torture, the history of torture, or something like that? Why does Gitmo's place matter? Well, of course, sites of conscience had many of them, like the Gulag Museum, were very remote and hard to visit, had lots of experience producing traveling exhibits, recreating sites that had been destroyed through drawings and other kinds of oral histories, and mapping, trying to expose and help root people in where things were and why it mattered where things were through mapping. What is happening right here at UMass, and I just want to end with, and invite all of you to continue to participate, is an effort to build a national conversation about Guantánamo and its current implications. And one of the manifestations of that is a collaboration among about a dozen universities, and UMass is one of them, to build to do a course on the history of Gitmo. So people have, this happened this fall, and everybody learned about this history through the semester. The final project of the course is to create a portion of the exhibit, as well as digital projects and other oral histories. Each university is hosting the exhibit. It'll be here opening September 11th, in fact, 2013, along with programming that you can help participate in and shape. But it's opening, the exhibit is opening in just a month on Washington Square, in an incredibly public space right on the street. And we'll have each section of the exhibit is developed by a different university team that, because they range from places like Pensacola, Florida, which is the cradle of naval aviation, to right here in Amherst, Massachusetts, very different kinds of communities, very different political perspectives, and each of those perspectives is shaping the different part of the exhibit and the conversation that's behind it. Each panel of the exhibit has a place where the students who created it talk about their perspective and their point of view. And the idea behind this was not just to build an exhibit that people would see, but to create a process where students were having to both learn about the history and really grapple with it, and then teach about it. So there were about 150 students around the country involved in just making it, and they each talk to their family and talk to their communities and involve lots of other people, and are building a wider conversation around it. So we hope that that will engage more people. The exhibit also invites each visitors to respond to questions on their cell phones via text message that are of a larger import, and that'll be aggregated. And I just wanted to end with the this is a really rough mock-up, but this is, and I know they would probably like to have something else shown, but this is the portion of the exhibit that UMass is creating, and it's really orienting the whole people to where Guantánamo is and why it matters. So in the question and answer session, I'll invite those students to comment on their work here. But there's lots more opportunities to get involved, so I hope everybody will. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz, for that great presentation. I'd like to invite our other panelists also to come up now and open the floor up to question and answers. I was nervous out there that I wouldn't find many links between the presentations, but actually if you think about it, the Spanish, American, Cuban, Philippines War of 1898 that sort of began the age of the American Empire, formal age of American Empire, coincides with the disfranchisement, segregation, and the rise of Jim Crow and lynching in the South. So there are many connections here besides the explicit ones that our panelists talked about. So I'll open the floor up now. Any questions, raise your hands and maybe direct your question to the panelist to whom it is addressed. That would be helpful. Thanks. Okay, questions? Comments? Yeah, Ivan.
Yes, thank you so much for the great presentation. Just a quick comment regarding the quarantine of HIV patients or prisoners in Guantánamo. It's very interesting because in U.S. prisons you find similar things, that those with particular illnesses are quarantined from other prisoners. So, I mean, I just found that a very interesting link regarding kind of like the U.S. Transportation of prison empire into Guantánamo. I thought that was very interesting. So this is directed, I guess, can I do all three? Sure. There's a very interesting essay, Penitence for the Privilege by Mark Kahn, and he talks about the treatment, particularly in early America, in the 19th century in particular, about how African Americans are treated differently from whites when it comes to prisons themselves. And this is a very, very concrete history. And so considering that history, that is, for African Americans, prisons would basically function, were used as an institution of punishment, as opposed to whites, which was used as an institution of reform. And so considering that history, and considering what prisons mean now, especially regarding African Americans, do prisons have any kind of legitimacy? That is, I'm raising the question of prison application. Should prisons exist, not only as they are currently formed, but should they exist at all?
I guess you could probably guess that my answer is that as they exist currently, they should be abolished. That is Sophia Elijah's position. That's not the position of the Correctional Association. So for the commercial, that's my personal position. I think that if we really focused our talents, energies, and intelligence on developing more humane responses to the needs of people, we ought to be able to craft a society where prisons aren't necessary at all. That's a major challenge based on how poorly we've done so far. But I believe that we have the resources, both intellectually and financially, to craft a system such that we shouldn't have to incarcerate people in order to address their needs. And that if we front-ended providing support mechanisms for people, that we ought to be able to create a society where we don't have to incarcerate people. Now, some might say that I've really drunk the Kool-Aid, but you know, I can have hope.
I just want to add something to maybe disagree tiny bit with my sister. I for years did prisoner conditions lawsuits, and Sophia knows this, and I've been in prisons all over the country, and I think that there is a very, very, very small population of people that need to be confined. And by that I mean, I think in all the prisons I've been in prisons in all throughout Arizona, Kentucky, District of Columbia, on and on and on. I think I may have met 3 or 4 people in all of these prisons, are big prisons, that actually probably needed some form of segregation from other people. And I think that that actually supports her point, but I think it also says that there, in addition to not really needing prisons as we know it, there needs to be some form in which we deal with that very, very small, less than 1%, if that many, people that can't really function safely in a society. And because there are just a very, 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 very few of them. And so I think that we have to recognize that, but at the same time in recognizing that, we recognize really how insane the current prison system is that we have. Because that's just, like I said, I mean, that's like maybe 3 or 4 people out of thousands upon thousands upon thousands that I know of in prison. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, there was a time when, you know, breaking a person's body over a wheel was considered acceptable, and I think talking about prisons and ways in which we can reform or even imagine a world where something's just become unacceptable is probably not so utopian as we might think. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's primarily for Professor Aiyetoro. You talked early in your speech about how early slaves their identities were sort of destroyed by the institution of slavery, and I'd like to hear your comments maybe about how that lack of identities filtered down and maybe became some sort of race consciousness or not, but outside of the economic imperative, sort of outside of the economic side of it.
Thank you. First of all, if I did, I made a terrible mistake because I don't call Africans slaves. I call them enslaved people. So if I call them slaves, I have to apologize to me and my ancestors. I think in some ways this is also a question I think that Soffiyah can weigh in on, or if she would like. Because I think what happened was very interesting in some ways, because in destroying a people and in destroying a person's identity, so to speak, all those cultural factors that we call identity, there was a creation of a new identity. And what we find now as we look in terms of current day, I mean, there are many groups of Africans and African descendants that have gone back to Africa to learn some of the religion and some of the cultural expressions, and have incorporated that into their own existence here in the United States. There are those who have in having what we can't actually ever get back what was taken, but have, in creating this new identity, so to speak, have integrated both, in quotes, America and U.S., really, because America is much bigger than the United States, even though sometimes we want to think it's not. But the U.S. and Africa and Caribbean and all of that kind of culture is all mixed up, and people have consciously mixed it up. You see, for example, lots of African descendants who some dress almost totally in African dress, some mix it up, some, you know, take on other forms of dress. So I think that not making the taking of or stripping of identity a positive, but I think it shows how human nature and resiliency of human nature creates an identity. I think that sad thing is, at least for me, is that many of us have worked on creating and recreating an identity, and there are people who have not and have attempted to take on the identity of the oppressor and run into all kinds of, that's another discussion, mental health issues as well, because they don't really know who they truly are. And none of us really do who are from, many of us don't, who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, but in attempting to reclaim that, I think that there's something about that attempt touches the soul of that person who's doing it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
We still have time for questions. With two hands up here, we'll go first to David and then Dan. David.
Many of you know the benefactor of this series, Ken Feinberg, is best known for talking about victim compensation. And I wondered if, particularly the discussion about slavery, what's the current state of reparations and those kinds of movements to actually compensate people in the same way that people are compensated as the victim of a crime or other kinds of injustice?
Okay, well, my sister just said, well, that'll take us the rest of the night. But I'll start and then my sister will add. The state of the reparations movement is, I'm not sure there's one word that can describe the state. I think that we've had our ups and our downs in the movement. We had a big peak in the early 2000s and late 1900s that was kind of a peak, and I think part of that came at the heels of the Japanese Americans getting reparations and people feeling that, you know, that's a push for Africans and African descendants. I think that the 9/11 actually it did two things. I mean, I'm probably totally more than two things. But we were coming back from the World Conference Against Racism on a real high because the language in the documents actually supported reparations. It said that slavery is a crime against humanity and should always have been so. And then also the documents called for reparations and named African Americans as well as Africans. The whole 9/11 took away a lot of that energy because, of course, for a number of weeks after that, people were focused on 9/11 and people had this thought that if we talk about, and that's not us, I'm not saying we did, but we had to show unity, so we couldn't talk about anything that didn't show unity. So I think that atmosphere actually negatively impacted the reparations movement because we were on, you know, you kind of moving, the snowball was going down the hill, and in that instance we were going up the hill. And then something happens and it pushes you back. I think that we had again another kind of upsurge, I think, with some of the litigation wasn't successful, but I think it was an organizing tool that was very helpful to get people to talking about it again. Scholars had really picked up since the late 1900s to 2000s in writing about it. But the movement itself, I think, is fractured in many ways, and in a lot of ways. And I think that those of us who still are committed to it and are working for it have to figure out a way to address the fracture. But I think that, you know, it's in a state, and I think that part of the reason it also is more fractured is that people continue to focus on it, and that's something COBRA has tried not to do, you know, some COBRA leaders do it, but others is that they focus on reparations for slavery as opposed to reparations for the continuing vestiges of slavery. So So what people think is that was way back, slavery was over in 1865, how do you repair something way back then, and they disassociated from what I was talking about earlier. But that's a shorter answer. I don't know about short, but short.
I just want to add to what Adjoa was sharing. There was the groups that have received reparations have not won it as a result of litigation. They've used litigation as a tool to draw attention to the issue in the same way that the efforts were made in the past, I guess, 10, 20 years of litigation on behalf of African descendants to try to gain reparations in this country. The intervention of 9/11 certainly had a major impact. Repeatedly, the court cases were lost that pushed for reparations for people of African descent. And then you had the, quote unquote, what I call the dream come true of the election of President Obama. And that caused many people of African descent and white people to feel that the answer had come, the Messiah had come, reparations really were addressed through the election of President Obama. And a lot of the focus and importance of the reparations movement was lost. The thunder was taken out of it in large measure because many people felt that victory had been declared with the election of President Obama. And it's been extremely difficult, I think, to overcome that in the years since. I'm not saying that, obviously, that the election of President Obama was a bad thing, but with respect to the push for reparations, it's been very, very difficult to gain any traction since that time.
Thanks. You should have a question for Liz then?
I do. It's not
Good.
for everyone, but it's for Liz.
All right, because I was going to also ask her, maybe I'll let you ask a question, and then I was also going to ask, okay, and I would also like to, maybe elaborate a little bit about the current status of Guantánamo under President Obama, what exactly he did do and what he didn't do. I think students here would be eager to find that out, right? And the students who have participated in this project maybe can talk about that too. So Dan, go ahead.
Well, just real quickly, as we were putting this panel together, we knew we wanted to have something about the U.S. being ready for ready for truth and reconciliation. And what fell into place was a panel that deals with 3 different types of coerced confinement that people often don't think of as being connected to one another. And we've heard about some of the connections between slavery and mass incarceration. And it was really interesting to me to see that Guantánamo has been used as this site of confinement for several different types of people. And I'm wondering how we can maybe further and deepen the conversation about Guantánamo by talking about it in connection to these other forms of confinement, particularly mass incarceration, and how do you do that, and how do you have these different conversations about these different forms of historical injustice that need to be addressed because of the legacies conversing together and working together.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the real points that a lot of the people who launched the project wanted to make that came up in the debate about whether the place of Guantánamo mattered was to make sure that it was very clear in any public memory project we developed that Guantánamo is not unique, and that it is unique in many ways. Its geography is unique, its legal status is unique, but that it's connected to and sort of has been shaped by and has shaped a lot of other places and policies, and looking at those connections is really important. And I know that's one of the things that the students are going to be looking at. It's also in the digital mapping part of the project. Oh, I'm looking at it. You can't see it, can you? That's all right. It's not a big deal. But each of the places that we identify, oh, there you go. This is still in development, but each of the places that will be identified on the map in the digital project invites anybody who's contributing this, because all of this is contributed by participants, to identify a related location. So this is one of the places, and this is also happening on 2 of the panels in the exhibit that are making specific reference to the relationship between Guantánamo and prisons in the U.S. So in one case, they're looking at, and this sort of gets to, where's the chair? To your question about the state of Guantánamo now and why isn't it closed. And President Obama pledged to close it. By his definition, was to move the prisoners into federal supermax prisons in the U.S., including a prison called Terre Haute in Indiana. One of the teams is from Indiana, and so they've developed their whole portion of the exhibit about the relationship between Guantánamo and Terre Haute, and looking at both the similarities of the conditions and the sort of strategies of incarceration, but also the differences in the way people have been tried, and the fact that Timothy McVeigh was at Terre Haute, John Walker Lynn, so these are people who committed terrorist acts, similar to the ones that Guantánamo prisoners are accused of, but were tried within our justice system and incarcerated in supermax prisons. But the proposal to move prisoners from Guantánamo into any prisons in the U.S. was soundly opposed by local congresspeople who couldn't, who were answerable to their local constituencies. There's no way they were going to say, yeah, go ahead, bring the Guantánamo, to District 38 and whatever. So as a result of this sort of one analysis is that because of this kind of NIMBY situation, or the fact of the way that representative, that legislatures work as answerable ultimately, that national policy gets set by local communities. Nobody wanted to take the prisoners, so Guantánamo was still open, and Obama upheld the legality or the right of the U.S. government to detain people indefinitely at Guantánamo through explicit sort of acts that sort of re-articulate that. So the lease is indefinite. And the confinement is indefinite. Whether in his second term he takes another stab at it in some other way, but the legislature is not going to change its mind. I don't think. So those comparisons between the University of California at Riverside, their portion of the exhibit is looking at some comparison with California prison system, because it's one of the largest prison systems in the nation, and just sort of they're kind of still struggling with what that connection is. But they have about a day to work that out, so as all of you guys know, it's due tomorrow. I did just want to take, I know we only have 3 more minutes, but I just wanted to give the students who worked on this a chance to share with you a little bit about what they're trying to do and what they were wrestling with, and maybe just what their hopes are for having this conversation here at UMass when it does come in about a year's time, sort of how you're, or from the professors working on this too, sort of how you want UMass to be engaged with this, and what kind of conversation about all these issues you want to have here when it comes. So you look like you're about ready to stand up. You look like the one who's...
Well, I guess...
Dan?
That's awkward. Well, I guess one of the things that we grappled with, and I'll just say, hi, my name is Marwa, and I'm one of the people working on this panel that will be here in 2013, and one of the things we sort of grappled with as historians, as people who are coming to this, as architects, we had our own sort of political opinions, and we were sort of grappling with presenting this panel. I'm sort of a little spacey right now. So we sort of, one of the things that we were sort of grappling with was how our political opinions would sort of come forward in this panel. And I know it's starting off in New York, and so I guess maybe Liz, you could talk a little bit more about that, because that's my sort of my question, I think some of us had, is that we thought this was a really political topic. We had really, really intense political reaction to this, and maybe I guess we're sort of feeling it, we are feeling it back to you, but maybe what is your sense, I guess, of this sort of panel starting off in New York, and how people are going to react to it throughout the United States, right? Because I think you had mentioned that for different people, like in Florida, who are sort of involved where the military is a really, really, people are just employed in the military, right? And this, closing it would then sort of make tons of people lose their job. Like what, there's just so many ways it's really, really political and really touches a lot of people. And I guess that's my long-winded way of sort of getting back to like where, yeah. Okay, yeah.
These are real questions and real concerns about us putting such a system right in New York. My name is John.
He's one of the students. Yeah, okay. I do wish we had a bit more time to have all of you speak about this project at greater length, but we are sort of running out of time, Marwa, so thanks for those comments. I do think that the attempt to move the prisoners to the mainland was to accord them some procedural fairness within the U.S. justice system and not have them as these sort of stateless, rightless people. But Soffiyah wanted to have the last word on this, and I will give her the last word on this, and after she finishes her comments, we will wind up for the evening. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. I rarely find myself being told that I have the last word, so I'm going to take that opportunity. I was really interested in the presentation about Guantánamo specifically because I hope that at least one of the universities that's going to focus on it will really focus on the question of sovereignty of the Cuban people and the Cuban government, and the fact that the Cuban government does not want the U.S. at Guantánamo anymore and has been fighting for decades to have it returned. So for me, that's really where the discussion begins and ends. If the Cubans don't want Guantánamo there, then it ought to be shut down, period, end of discussion. And what other things could be done with it, that's really not up to the U.S. That's up to the Cuban people. The other thing that I thought was important to focus on was the whole discussion about whether or not the current group of detainees who have been incarcerated without due process for over a decade now at Guantánamo, and the discussion about moving them to the U.S. really was focused not on the inhumane treatment at Guantánamo, although obviously it should have been, but on whether or not they would be afforded the due process and legal rights that other people who are put to trial in the United States would be afforded if they were on U.S. soil. So there was this gamesmanship that was going on with respect to whether or not the people who were in Guantánamo would be afforded the full panoply of legal rights that they ought to be afforded to if they were brought to the United States. So therefore, the ultimate decision, and the courts played games along with them, they were left in Guantánamo, not because anybody cared about their humanity, but really the goal was to strip them of yet more humanity. So I think that, or I'm hoping that one of the schools will focus on the reality, again, more hypocrisy as to what was really going on with the lives of the people who've been detained at Guantánamo. Thank you.
Well, yes, I've got the last word. Thank you for coming.